the computer with us?
Your meeting.
No. Got to. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Huh? Okay.
Hello.
As we have not heard yet from Chair Winslow, I will become acting chair and call the meeting of April the 8th, 2026 to order. First item on the agenda is the reading of the meeting minutes of March 25th. Are there any questions or concerns on those minutes?
Madam Acting Chair, I move that we approve the minutes of March 25th as presented.
I second.
Any questions on the motion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Aye, and Commissioner Correa?
Hi.
Thank you. Are there any members of the public who wish to make comments at this point in time? There being none, we will go on to the consent agenda. I believe there are 2 items. Does anybody want anything moved off of that agenda or changed in any way?
Madam Acting Chair, I move that we adopt the consent agenda as submitted.
I second.
Any questions on the motion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Hi.
Aye. All right, now we'll go on to the regular agenda in the matter of the adoption of rules and regulations to implement the provisions of 26 Delaware Code Chapter 10 relating to the creation of a competitive market for retail electric supply service opened April 27th, 1999. Ms. Workman, I believe it's you.
Yes, it is me. So we had the public comment session for this matter 2 meetings ago, the beginning of March. And once again, this is to tighten consumer protections from third-party electric suppliers. And this is in response to higher than normal billing from last year that we're again seeing this year. And we've been through this whole process 2 times already. We're starting our 3rd time. So staff, at our last public comment session, we received public comments from RESA, R-E-S-A, and staff had a chance to review those comments and found that almost all of their suggestions would make the regulation more reasonable for the electric suppliers without taking away the benefits for the consumers. Additionally, one of the changes, the largest portion of the change that we're recommending now is going to give more protection to the consumers. And because the changes are once again substantive, so we added quite a few things, change notice requirements. Those are going to be substantive. We have to do the process again according to the Administrative Procedures Act. So what staff is asking the commission to do today is to allow us to once again republish as proposed the newest version that you guys have in front of you. And we'll try and get that in the May register. And then we can have a public comment session and do this whole thing again. Fingers crossed we'll get it right this time. But you know, it's a evolving issue and we want to make sure that we get it right. So we make sure these regulations are beneficial to the consumers, but also can be applied by the entities that have to comply with them. So staff today asks that the commission enter the order as presented and give staff the authority to request that the registrar republish 3001. Thank you.
Any questions?
I have a question, Ms. Workman. So does the new regulation or did the old regulation prohibit an electric company from, or electric supplier rather, from co-branding with Delmarva on its notifications to customers or potential customers?
I do not believe there's a prohibition on that. But to my knowledge, it doesn't happen.
Just as follow-up, I recall the presentation from, what was the?
RESA
RESA.
or ESA.
We had that conversation here in the hearing room, and my understanding was that there would be, it wouldn't be necessary to say that they were unaffiliated with Delmarva, for example, but that the recommendation was that they not mention any distribution utility. And so was that adopted?
So the recommended adoption that staff has is to take away the specifics. So instead of the electric supplier saying we do not represent Delmarva Power, it has been replaced with we do not represent any utility and we do not represent any government agency.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you.
Any other questions? May I have a motion, please?
Madam Acting Chair, I move that we adopt order number 10996 as submitted.
I second.
Any questions on the motion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Motion carries. Thank you muchly. We are now on to the hearing schedule. Administrative matters is,
Thank you, Madam Acting Chair. I'd like to yield to Mr. Geddes for some prudence training.
A point of order, one moment, sorry. Matt, I think you were going to mention something about the LIHEAP letter.
Yes, I was going to do that later, but
Okay,
I'll do it
great.
now. Just to make the commission aware, the Trump administration in its proposed budget has eliminated all LIHEAP funding as they did last year. And NARUC is organizing a email campaign to each state's federal delegation or asking each commission to contact their federal delegation just to ask them to consider restoring the LIHEAP funding. So I plan to do that unless anyone objects. Thanks.
Well, this is styled as a training session. I'm not sure that's the right word to use. I think a workshop, perhaps interactive workshop would be better because I think we're all house trained, but I might be wrong about that.
Excuse me, Mr. Geddes, before you start. I'm going to ask just for a very brief contextual introduction to the subject, why we're doing it, what some of the, I'm sure you'll tell us the key differences, but why are we driven to do it?
Look at me.
Uh,
I was just asked to do it.
The last legislative session, the legislature passed Senate Bill 59, which changed the cost recovery standard from the business judgment rule to the prudence standard, which the prudence standard is used in, I think, every other state except one in the country. And it's a slightly higher bar for utilities to meet in order to recover costs. So that's kind of how we got here.
Commissioner, I was asked to try to review with you prudency, the standard. And I think most of you know that Delaware is unique in the fact that it's one of two states, although it's actually just one of one state up until last year, that did not apply prudency or the prudence standard. You may not know why. So I thought I would share with you, since I love history, a little bit about the history and how we got to be unique in such a interesting way. Discuss the case that basically said that prudency was not a standard that Delaware would recognize. Look at the language of the Senate Bill 59, the differences between business judgment and the prudency standard. Another subject that I think is very interesting is the impact of AI on this particular issue. Then look at some cases nationally and as well as locally in surrounding states. Maybe open it up to general discussion about some hypotheticals, and then just a general summary. So let's get started. This commission was formed in 1949, actually the year I was born. It was reconstituted in 1974. And up until the 1980s, I do not believe in all my research at the appellate level as well as the commission level that there was ever a case that used the concept of prudency. Obviously, Delaware's history with corporations and business judgment lends itself to why that standard seemed to be the appropriate standard. As Mr. Jordan indicated 2 weeks ago, 40 years ago, I argued in front of the Supreme Court this particular concept because the lower court, Superior Court judge, who was Joe Walsh, who was the original rate counsel in 1974. Only in Delaware could you make this all up. And of course, his son worked here as a Deputy Attorney General representing the staff. But Joe Walsh, as a Superior Court judge then, ultimately became a Supreme Court judge, decided in favor of staff that the fuel clause, which was the basis of the case, and I'll get into the facts briefly, should have incorporated the concept of prudency. That business judgment, given the fact that the fuel clause was an important component of overall costs, that it should be judged under the prudence standard. The Supreme Court disagreed. And so for the last 40 years, all decisions made by the utility that were challenged by the staff or the DPA were subject to business judgment, good faith business judgment. Now, Matt indicated that Delaware was one of two states. Actually, I think that's a misnomer. That's what the literature says. But Tennessee was the other state that did not apply prudency, but that's actually not correct. They don't say specifically in the statute they apply prudency, but they do in terms of gas procurement. So that's a little bit of an anomaly. So Delaware was out there for, pretty much 40 years. There's an old adage in the law that bad facts make bad law. And notwithstanding my personal interest in the Cole case, I was 36 years old when I argued that case. Seems a long time ago. I think that the case has many parallels to where we are today. And I thought I'd just review it quickly, because then I'm going to ask you some questions about whether you think the result might be different today, given the standard. So let's review it quickly. The factual context of the case, we had the Arab embargo 1973, 74. Does that sound somewhat familiar to today? We had the introduction of the fuel clause adjustment, section 303 to the code, and an effort, can we move down these slides? Who do I ask? Hello. They're also, every slide that's here is in front of you. We also have the fuel clause, which specifically said that the commission, rather than just rubber stamping these costs, which were obviously escalating quite dramatically, that there should be some kind of hearing process. And so that was the case that, that was the provision, the statute that really was in focus in the Cole case. And then we had the addition of the public advocate in 1978, who, with all due respect, Mr. Wilner, a very interesting guy, but he was also trying to make a name for himself and trying to, as all the decision makers were, trying to do whatever we could to reduce expenses for ratepayers. Does that sound familiar? So let's look at this case. Next slide, please. Now, Delmarva had decided that it wanted to move away from oil, and it had needed more generation in those days before 92. Delmarva controlled generation, transmission, and distribution. And so they had plans to build Indian River 4, and they decided to use compliance coal rather than oil. So they sent a gentleman out to negotiate these contracts, and they negotiated two contracts. One was Continental, the other was Avery. Now, with respect to the Continental contract, the negotiator decided that he would tie the escalators to the CPI and PPI without a cap, meaning in his testimony, the cap was the market. The Avery contract, which was the other contract, was tied to production costs. So as production costs changed, that contract escalated. But the Continental contract was completely different. It was tied only to the CPI and had no cap on it. As a result of the oil prices and the demand for compliance coal prices shot up. So the commission had this case. The public advocate brought it to the commission's attention, big headlines, $10 million overcharge, all this stuff. And the commission had to resolve it. The commission made 9 findings. Can we have the next slide, please? The ones I've highlighted in red are the ones that apply to Continental. And it found that the proposal of an unprecedented escalator in the contract negotiations was imprudent. It also found that a failure to secure protection against excessive price increases in the Continental contract was also imprudent. It also noticed in finding 3, failure to have a more skilled and knowledgeable negotiator was also a reason to disallow some of these expenses. We'll come back to that in a bit. Now, in my opinion, the Supreme Court still could have supported the commission and the Superior Court under 2 theories. One is the Hope case, which has been around forever, Hope versus natural gas, a Justice Douglas decision back in the 40s, I believe, which basically said that the end result is the most important. If the process comes out with just and reasonable rates, how you got there really is not that important. And we'll see that again in a more recent case involving a Pennsylvania decision. But as long as you have just and reasonable rates, the standards by which you get there are not as important as what the result is. The second way I think the court could have gotten there if it wanted to was abuse of discretion. I think on the facts that I just outlined, that you could argue persuasively that the company did abuse its discretion in not sending a negotiator that had more experience and also not putting a cap on these potential escalation clauses. But that's not what the court did. The court decided that, and it's one of those, I don't know if you've ever argued in front of a tribunal. I have a few times. But when they ask you the question you do not know the answer to. And so Justice Horsey, I remember it like it was yesterday. Justice Horsey said, now, Mr. Geddes, you do have a copy of the code. Yes, 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 I do have a copy. Are you familiar with Section 303? Yes, 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 I'm very familiar with it. Yes. Well, Mr. Geddes, can you please tell me, based on your familiarity with the section, where the word prudency appears? And it's like last week when Sauer was asked by Gorsuch, Justice Gorsuch, well, how does birthright citizenship apply to Native Americans? And it's that silence where you know that you've got to say something, but you're not exactly sure what you're going to say. So anyway, 40 years later, we are now back to where we started, or at least some of us tried to start us, with legislation by the legislature, Senate 59, that says prudency is now going to be standard that the commission should use in reviewing investments and expenses. And the concept of prudency has been around for a long time. I did have a slide of a reasonable man, looked like one of the founders, but basically somebody who uses his knowledge, his or her knowledge, to make reasonable decisions. For those of you who studied law, Professor Prosser, who was the dean of torts, had in his treatise, the reasonable prudent man standard, which is the careful conduct of his own actions in avoiding personal injury to others, both as to his actions and the foreseeability of the consequences of those actions. That's an important point. And it would apply in business affairs and economic use of property involved. Now, I have put in front of you as an attachment a portion of a NRRI report 1985 that lists all the prudency cases, well, not all, but a lot of prudency cases from the 40s through 1985. All of those are searchable. All of those you can look at. But I do think it's a good collection of cases across the country that were litigated or otherwise decided in the 40 years that Delaware decided that this concept shouldn't apply. The earliest case I could find, it's not in this list, is Middlesex versus Boston. It was decided in 1914. So the concept has been around for a long time and applied in lots of different ways. Senate Bill 59 tries to bring Delaware into the 21st century consistent with the case law in other states. And should be noted that because prudency, and we've done this hundreds of times, the witnesses say, well, it's not prudent. Well, that's not the standard in Delaware. Well, I know, but it's not prudent. You couldn't use any of that case law in any of the cases we brought before you because the standard's different. Now, there are lots of corporate cases that you can use the business judgment standard, but they don't involve utility regulation. They involve corporate issues, management issues. So it did create somewhat of a problem in terms of trying to find support for particular positions we might have taken. But if you look at slide 7, are we up to 7? Yeah, there we are. This is part of Senate Bill, the synopsis of Senate Bill 59. I want you to look particularly at the last sentence of that, amending the Public Utility Code so that the prudence standard applies would give the Public Service Commission, the ability to deny in whole or in part certain expenses and costs, which can lead to less frequent and less impactful rate increases. Now, that's the goal. And I will, perhaps suggest later on that that might be harder to achieve than you would think. The difference between the business judgment rule is that management decisions could only be disallowed, or the costs related thereto, proof of fraud, waste, abuse of discretion. Uneconomic or oversized investments could be fully recovered as long as they were made in good faith without fraud or waste. Historically, therefore, those disallowances were rare. It's not to say that there weren't some that were made, but the legislatures wanted to establish a higher standard, more consistent with case law and decisional law across the country. But now we're going to start to drill down into what the statute says and the application of the statute. Let me suggest this hypothetical. Exelon, which is the company that owns Delmarva Power through subsidiaries, operates in 48 states, as well as Canada and DC. All of the other states subject their investment decisions to prudency reviews, all of them. Do you really think, hypothetically, when they are making management decisions about what to invest in, that they say, Delaware, business judgment, we will put XYZ investment in there, but have a different standard for everywhere else? No, they make their investment decisions across the board. And Delaware just happens to be part of that, of the 4 states that they have utilities in. So question, would the change in this standard materially affect Exelon's decision-making, or PHI, or wherever you want to say the ultimate decision is being made? Would it really impact what they are doing? I just raised that question. Also in your materials is a front page of a law review article. Vermont happens to be one of my favorite states, which is quite good. I didn't copy the whole thing because you can go find it if you want to read it. It's a 2005 law review article. And it involves one of my favorite corporations, Pacific Corp, which I was fortunate enough to be involved in litigation with them years ago.
Is it in the packet, Jim?
At the last page. The last page. Oh, I had 2 packets. Apologize. It's the one with the NRI stuff. But what it tries to discern, Pacific Corp is a major utility out in the West. They're headquartered in Oregon, maybe Washington, but they also are in Oregon and in Wyoming. And during the energy crisis out West, early 2000s, Pacific Corp was forced to buy on the wholesale spot market covering energy, and ended up spending $90 million in excess energy costs. They went to Wyoming, as prudency, to try to recover some of those costs. Wyoming said no, because I can't remember what the reasoning was, but it wasn't necessary or whatever. Oregon used prudency and allowed them to recover the costs. Same standard, different commissions. One utility, similar to Delmarva and its parent. They operate in many jurisdictions. And one of the drawbacks to prudency is, how is it applied? It's easy to say that the manager should know and use reason in making decisions about investments or expenses. But the application of that to the facts sometimes becomes more difficult. Slide 10. This is a decision-making tree for business judgment versus prudency. They're just, on the left-hand side, or what people consider under the business judgment versus prudency. I do like the 4th block on the right. It says it's beneficial for ratepayers and regulators. not exactly sure what they mean by that, but in any event, that's what it says. Slide 10. This is a fun slide, not for the people that are trying to do this, but I thought I would put it in here because if you think your decision-making is difficult, here is the New Orleans Commission with the energy company trying to determine what is necessary to modernize the facilities. But the red line is what I love. This reliability equation is further complicated by the fact that the distribution system it serves is hurricane prone. The city is built in a swamp. It's surrounded by water on 3 sides and sits largely below sea level, and where 30% of the residents live below the poverty line. So how do you reach the balance, again, hypothetical, between trying to make sure that the citizens of New Orleans have energy without overburdening so many of them that are below the poverty line? When you have old facilities in a very difficult place to deliver energy. Again, my equation, bad facts make bad law. That's a pretty difficult thing to try to parse. Anyway, we also have some cases. These you can look at. They're not the most modern cases, but I think they're good cases to try to understand the concept of how prudency is used. I also have some slides on, well, this is, oh, I think I skipped over AI. How did I do that? Where is AI? Hello, AI. Where are you? All right, I have to catch up with my slides. So an overlay on this is, of course, the application of AI. Because now the ability to forecast, as we all know, and to know everything, whether you use ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot, Perplexity, what else is out there? A couple more. You now have access to information that 2 or 3 years ago you could not find. As Commissioner Conway was saying, her TV is talking to her. Now your refrigerator will tell you what's in it and what you need to go buy. I mean, this is a slippery slope, I think, especially when you are trying to figure out foreseeability. What is reasonable under the circumstances without using hindsight? So in essence, the equation is that you are 2 or 3 years perhaps ahead of when the decision was made. You know information that was not knowable at the time the investment decision was made, but maybe the facts and circumstances have changed, and now it looks like it was imprudent, not reasonable, but at the time the individuals were making that decision, they used the best knowledge that they had. It's a very difficult thing to do. I analogize it to Elon Milan trying to do a quad axel at the Olympics. I mean, he can do it. He has done it, but it's not easy to do. And so it's again, it's the application that makes it more difficult. But here are some of the effects of AI on prudence reviews. Here are some of the things that commissioners should consider. Was the model used for forecasting or operations tested and explainable? Did management rely on AI as a decisional support or just as a substitute for judgment? Were the assumptions behind AI-driven investments consistent with the evidence available at the time? And did the utility document oversight, error check, and fall back on procedures? Now on to the examples. The Florida case, which is there's a couple references to cases on the slide. And then behind that, there's a little table. If we go to the next one. Here's an interesting point. The Florida case was dealing with prudence review with regard to a storm planning process. And the question was whether prudency, the concept of prudency, should apply at the planning process or only at the time that the commission was asked to assess those costs to ratepayers in a rate case. And in Florida, it decided that at the planning process, it was not necessary to use prudency. Used and useful was sufficient. And that prudency would be used to determine whether those costs were reasonable to pass on to ratepayers. So that raises a dichotomy. We've been asked many times, the royal we, no, the commission's been asked many times to prejudge investments by utilities, in particular Delmarva. And in most cases has declined. Said, no, we're not in the pre-approval process. And your staff has argued vigorously for you not to, try to approve something. But large contracts, procurement ideas, sometimes you have to. So the question raised in the Florida case is, all right, fine. So it's used and useful. At the time the investment was made, the plan is approved. And then subsequently things go pear-shaped, as they say in Australia. And you realize that this is not such a great idea. And you're being asked to approve the recovery of those results under a prudency standard. Standards are different. And is that the appropriate application of prudency in that situation? I raise that as a potential issue. Couple local cases, Maryland, which is, that's the Columbia Gas case. This slide says that Maryland applies prudence as a rate-making filter. If the utility acted reasonably and the costs were prudently incurred, recovery is more likely. The utility's management was imprudent, costs can be disallowed. The Columbia Gas case, which 2015 case, you can just put in Columbia Gas, Maryland, it'll kick it out. Denied recovery of remediation costs, even though they were not imprudently incurred. As similar Chesapeake, we've had remediation costs with Chesapeake before this commission, but they were not recoverable because they found they were not used and useful for current customers. Interesting. The Equitable case in Pennsylvania, also another state that uses prudence, disallowed pass-through of gas costs because the utility had available lower cost supply, but chose more expensive purchases. Commonwealth Court upheld the disallowance as imprudently incurred and excessive. Now, this case refers to hope. Remember, I said earlier on in the coal case, I thought we could have gotten by the absence of prudency in the fuel clause statute by using the Hope decision, which says as long as the result's reasonable, how you get there really is not the important inquiry. And this specifically but mentions Hope in that decision. And then New Jersey, also prudence, but again, applied differently than either Maryland or Pennsylvania. My point here is that the concept is easy to explain on a piece of paper. You should make reasonable decisions using the information in front of you that you could reasonably expect to have in front of you. easily said, but then how do you apply it to the facts? And with AI, what model do you use? And how did you bench test it? I will give you one of my favorite examples. Are we doing on time? Well, not too bad on time. Weather. I love weather. And I study weather, sailed around the world. Obviously, weather was important to me. It's been important to me ever since I got back on shore. This past winter, your weather models predicting, because utilities have to, figure out what is going to snow, whether the hurricane's going to show up, and these are all, expectation models. In the weather world, there are 3 models that are currently being used to predict weather. One's the European model, which is preferred. 300 people work on it, something like that. The GFS model is the American model. 30 people work on it. And now there is the new AI model, which is, I refer to it as has training wheels. It's coming along, but it's not there yet because we know AI is iterative. So it's learning the whole time and it's getting better, but it's not there. So this past winter, the European model said we'd have 9 northeasters. We had 9 northeasters. Delaware didn't have 9. We call them fish storms when they go out to sea. The northeasters were there. They were all Miller Bs, which basically means they start in the Gulf and come up because they, they come out of Ohio. Then the low gets to the mountains. Then another low develops on the coast and goes up the coast. Well, in February, you got one. 13 inches of snow in Sussex County. You also had one in January, one in March, but I don't think it affected Delaware. So 3 out of the 9. Well, if you use the GFS model, every one of those 9 storms was going up the coast and mid-Atlantic could get smashed. Every one. That's what it predicted. So every time you had the snowstorm coming in 5 to 10 days, GFS said, it's going up the East Coast, going up the East Coast. European said, no. But the one storm that hit Sussex County was a GFS model. Now, if you're a forecaster and you're making investment decisions on the best models that are available, what model do you use? And if you use the wrong model, is that imprudent? Was that not reasonable? They're the best models that exist. And they don't say the same thing. We all know, it's an extreme example, I understand, because weather forecasting more than 5 days is, not even an art. It's just impossible. AI will get you there. AI will get you to 15 days. AI is going to get you to 20 days because it is constantly learning. And as you look through this particular winter season, which was very active on the East Coast, you could see the AI model was starting to get it right. Not always, but was a lot closer than it was last year. Because last year it was ridiculous. Nobody even mentioned it. Now the best weather forecasters are using the AI as a comparison. But it goes back to, okay, and eventually I will make this point in a different way. How much effort are we going to put into trying to decide whether the model was right, the investment was right, based on our resources versus the utilities' resources? Because they don't make these decisions lightly. So let's open it up to sort of a general discussion. Everybody wants to participate, or you can stay in the back of the room and say, oh, well, I hope he doesn't call on me. Leave that, go back to that slide. Let's just start there. Does anybody know what that is? Fired. Anybody else? No, I shouldn't have said that. That's a Trump thing, isn't it? No, no, that's Indian River. Yeah, we'll come back to that. So let's talk about the coal case, my favorite case. Hypothetically, do you think that might have been decided differently if we had the Senate version of 59, the change to Section 201, general jurisdiction of the commission, and burden of proof under Section 307, where expenses have to be prudent in order to be recovered from ratepayers? Do you think the coal contract not using unproven escalators and no market cap would subject it to being denied as imprudent costs? I think most people would probably say probably. Even Justice Horsey, I think, would have said, well, and I would have been able to point and say, Your Honor, it's right there, the word prudent. So let me ask you a harder hypothetical using this plant. If you know anything about this plant, in the 80s, they decided that there was too much fly ash going in the Delaware River. Now, this was before Delaware had established with using Colin Seitz arguing in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that the Delaware River is owned by Delaware and that New Jersey has no right to build an LNG facility on its shores. I went to the Supreme Court and we won it because back in the day, the circle included the Delaware River. But for purposes of this analysis, in the 80s, they wanted the fly ash was going in the river, and they said, well, the solution is we'll just build a big concrete stack and blow it into New Jersey. And that's what they did. And that stack used to be, this is true, I'm not making this up, that stack used to be the tallest structure in Sussex County. Now, I don't know whether it still is, but it's a pretty tall stack. So my hypothetical to you is, let's assume EPA comes and says, look, you got to get the fly ash out of the river. Okay, we've got two choices. We can build the concrete stack, or we can put scrubbers in, which are more expensive, which will eliminate the fly ash problem going across the river, but they're more expensive. The stack is legal, but it's cheaper. Let's assume that the utility decides to go with the scrubbers, even though the stack is cheaper. Is that imprudent? Let's assume further that the societal benefits or costs that they have an expert that comes in and says basically the scrubbers are more expensive because the societal cost of throwing that ash into New Jersey from an environmental standpoint, if you try to monetize that, if you do monetize it, is more than the scrubbers. So now what? And you're looking at this 2 years later, the stack's either been built or the scrubbers have been put in. And the utility's coming to you and saying, all right, we want to recover these costs. And then an expert on behalf of the DPA or staff says, no, you should have used a different solution that was cheaper. Yeah.
But couldn't you then say, we will let you recover up to the prudent cost?
What are the prudent costs?
What it would have cost if you'd done the tower, excluding the environmental costs or including the environmental costs, or are they even?
Yeah, there's no right answer. It's just one of these. And what a lot of commissions do when they have a plant that is used and useful, because both would be used and useful. The question is whether one's imprudent, one's not, one's reasonable, one's not, is they try to split the difference. They allow the tower or the scrubbers in rate base, but they don't give you a return on it. So there's some attempt to sort of not completely deny recovery, but maybe not allow you full recovery by splitting off the return. Something to think about. So the last slide, I think it's the one before. Yeah, this one. Here are some questions. Anybody wants to take a pass at them? Does the business judgment rule have any meaning for Delaware post this piece of legislation? Another one is, we've talked about a little bit, if plan additions found to be used and useful, can a portion of it still be disallowed for imprudent investment? I think the answer to that question is yes. Now here's where we go back to the slide that the legislature, the synopsis that said, hopefully this will reduce the number of rate cases and the costs associated with them. This is something you should also think about. What impact does the Senate bill have on discovery in future utility cases? Because now you're trying to determine what is reasonable. And that, I would say, in this computer-driven era is not going to be an easy task. Because you are going to have consultants who are not necessarily accountants, no disrespect to accountants, but who have the expertise in these types of investments, who can run this type of modeling and have the ability to say, well, no, that was not a prudent investment because of X, Y, Z. Back to the weather examples, because it's the easiest. Okay, you shouldn't have used the European model, you should have used the American model, and here are the reasons why. So you're now going to have a huge food fight with regard, assuming the money, assuming it's a big number, and the discovery on this. Because your discovery is going to be, okay, tell me, it's like Howard Baker back in the 70s. What did he know and when did he know it? Okay, so who made the decision? What do they look at? Why did they look at it? Why didn't they look at something else? It's a lot harder to prove unreasonable than reasonable, because under the business judge, the assumption's there. And you had to say, well, it's waste, abuse, or bad faith. Tough standard. Here, it's all right. And once you challenge it, now the review process is, okay, was it reasonable at the time it was made without using hindsight? And that's a much more difficult task, I would suggest to you, than perhaps applying the business judge standard. The other one is data centers. Now, again, Delmarva is, and again, I'm only talking about electric, is only transmission and distribution. But if somebody decides to put a big data center somewhere here, you're going to need a way to get the power to them. And let's assume that that looks like a great idea. And then 3 or 4 years from now, I don't know, the need's not there, something else happens. Because there is, in the literature, everyone wants to have a data center except Maine. Maine's decided no data centers here just recently. And then all of a sudden the demand for them goes away or is reduced. How is that going to affect the review when they're trying to get the infrastructure costs into rates? And the last one is for my co-counsel over here. When will the commission be required to apply the prudence standard in a case in Delaware?
Likely not until next year. Right now, we're dealing with 2 rate cases. One of them is the Artesian rate case that was filed, I think, in March of 25, and that was before this bill passed. And so our understanding moving forward is that we're using the old standard, the business judgment standard for that one. And then the Delmarva electric base rate case, which the parties have all agreed to use the prudent standard. And that's scheduled for sometime next year, next spring. I don't remember which month exactly.
March.
Right, March.
We were alive. Some of us are still alive. So those are some of the questions. And I guess my point is that this is not, the standard, changing the standard has obviously some goals, but it also comes with some costs. And it's just not a panacea for lower rates, because the transactional costs of trying to litigate these cases has gone up exponentially. And so my last slide, can't see it. Well, I can read it for you. So this is a little bit of whimsical, but the answer, is it in there? With all the computers and all of the AI and information that is available, it is going to be interesting to see how this impacts decision-making and applying the prudency standard with regard to investments in the future. Because I don't think you can find the answer in a computer. It's going to have to be the practical application of the principle on the facts and circumstances of the case. Let's go back to the New Orleans example. That is a completely different situation than, say, the Delmarva Peninsula. And your decision-making has to reflect the area in which you're authorized to set rates. And so I don't think prudency as a standard can be applied the same way in each and every state. And if you look at the Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania examples that I gave you, you'll see that it is applied differently by different commissions. Thank you.
So a couple of questions. First of all, will the prudent rule versus business rule, prudence, will that mean when you're talking about litigating, when you're talking about discovery, that, for example, a utility says, we built a building for $1 million. And under business rule, would we say, okay, so you will get, into rate case, this X return. And then do we say, under prudence rule, we're going to go in and we're going to say, you shouldn't have used this kind of hardwood. You shouldn't have, had these giant offices. You shouldn't have, spent money to make this nice or this X, or this location, which was more expensive than where you might have otherwise built it, somewhere else in the state. Is that going to translate into that kind of line iteming that somebody's going to do, an auditor's going to do?
Theoretically, it could. But remember, the presumption is the same to start. Unless it's challenged by the DPA or the staff or an intervener, the presumption is, whether it's prudency or business judgment, that it will be recovered from ratepayers. But there are hundreds, like widgets and everything else. We don't challenge. We try to, when we look at a case, analyze a case, we try to look at the number. I hate to say this because it sounds so crass. Biggest bang for the buck. In other words, we're not going to be looking at chairs and woodwork and pencils. We're going to be looking for things that seem out of place, that may appear unnecessary. I tell you, and I'm trying to answer your question, reliability. How much reliability is necessary? Now, we know historically that SAIDI and SAFE numbers used to be a lot higher. Now they're a lot lower. The DPA has indicated in its comments about the legislation is the number of cases and how much, Delmarva has sought over the last couple of years in terms of rate-based additions. I raise the question, hypothetically, how much SAIDI and SAFE do we need? Do we need to drive it to the lowest number in the country? Or is there some level of reliability that's acceptable? I mean, do you want to go buy a Tesla truck or whatever you call those things, or tank, so that you are safer on the road? Or do you want to buy a Maserati or a Corvette? I mean, there are compromises people make in terms of, yeah, they could make cars that you would never get hurt in, but is that what people want to ride in? You could make a gold-plated distribution system, but is that what customers want to pay for? That's a balance. And I would say that as the SAIDI and SAFE numbers go down, at some point, somebody's going to raise the question, well, now, wait a second here. Do we really need, as we're trying to reduce the impact of rate increases, which is hard to do given what's going on with energy costs and the demand, are we willing to perhaps, agree to a lesser standard with regard to reliability in order to avoid some of the rate shock? Hope that answered your question.
So another question, when you talk about litigation costs going up, I mean, to me, that seems quite obvious that it will, and there will be more litigating of cases and just more items. I mean, not so many generalities. Will the cost of that litigation, which I don't know right now is a percentage of an overall rate case, but will that offset significantly any potential cost savings that using this rule will have?
Hard to say. I mean, if you're talking about a multi-million-dollar item, and the litigation cost to establish that it's imprudent or get the company to compromise, because, you know, we do settlements, 512. At the beginning, cold case, there was no 512. So you might, through your discovery process, you know, push the company to say, okay, well, that particular building, coal plant, whatever it is not, we're not going to seek recovery of it, or we'll seek partial recovery. You may drive the company, hypothetically, into different decision-making on big investments. The other thing, I think you will find more attempts at pre-approval, more attempts at trying to get some sense of whether big investments will be recovered from ratepayers. And the other thing, I will throw this out there, what impact does this have on the cost of capital? Now, it shouldn't have, putting on my staff hat, this is my hat, one I wear. It shouldn't have any. But you could make the argument that the cost shouldn't go down as a result because of the unpredictability of perhaps making investments that now are subject to a more stringent standard. I could see somebody trying to make that argument.
So my last question is, and I'm seeking your opinion here. In your opinion, over the 40 plus years since 1982, when I graduated from college,
81.
I was still in college then. Would Delaware ratepayers have saved a significant amount of money if we had always used that rule?
I don't think so. I mean, when I was trying to put some of this information together, I was trying to go back through my little, you know, whiz, you know, computer. And I was trying to think about, most of this stuff was driven during the generation booms of the 70s and 80s. When we had Salem, we cooked a generator over there. We had Sleepy Hollow at Peach Bottom where operators were asleep, operating a nuclear plant. Those were the ones that sort of stand out because they like, now wait a second here, we're not gonna, the outage, hypothetically, the outage in Salem, they cooked a generator. I know that's pejorative, but anyway, the generator didn't function anymore. And PG&E, yes, ESG, tried to argue that the outage they had to take to fix the generator actually saved ratepayers money. They had slides, they had all kinds of stuff saying that this actually saved them money. Well, they didn't win that argument, but they tried. It was very creative. So because generation is such a huge component of the whole grid, I do think that it's dealing with just the transmission and distribution is probably less likely that it would have saved money. But let's go back to another one, Weldon Road. Well, there was a lot of discussion in the last case about that because of the way the distribution system was built, the outages that had consequential damages for the customers, and the company's position, well, this is just the way it's built. I mean, it's been there forever and we're getting to it, but it's just one of those things that happens. So again, I don't think there was a big dollar issue that would have made a big difference using a difference in standard. I think what I'm trying to say is the standard's there. It's a more stringent standard, but I'm not sure it's going to move the needle that much.
Thanks. Thank you for your answers.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. That was interesting, thought-provoking. I'll start my comments by saying, or making the assumption that somebody decided to apply prudence in DC last night. Thank God. So with
It wasn't in the utility context. Was it?
so a couple of things that hit me as you walk through the subject matter. Are there any differences when you talk about prudence? Are there any differences between costs, expenses, and investments? Or can prudence cover all of them? Because they're not exactly the same.
It can cover all of them. I think the sense of the legislature is that it's supposed to cover all of them. And you have it in the general 201 jurisdiction that the commission has, and then you have it particularly laid out in the burden of proof that all the expenses have to be prudent.
Okay, so that leads me then into if the commission is driven, well, let me just clarify one comment I think you made. I think you said that the interveners bring the concept of prudence to the commission. It's not that the commissioners are looking for a prudent position to take with regard to what's in front of us.
No, I probably misspoke. What I was trying to say is that when you're dealing with experts who work in other jurisdictions, they always, couch their opinions using the word prudent. And what you have to do in Delaware is basically say, take that word out and use another word, because we don't have prudency here. That's all pre the Senate Bill 59. Now your experts can use the terminology prudency without, the Delaware caveat. That's
Okay,
what I was
but
trying to get across.
But we're still, as a panel, sitting and taking testimony and evidence, and prudence will be presented in front of us as opposed to us sitting here looking for the prudent
Yeah,
position to take.
Yes, because you only, well, again, I'm trying to think of an example where the commissioner, there have been examples where commissioners have said, okay, I want you to look at this. And staff is directed to go out and look at something. But the normal process is that company has their case, we put on our case, we look at certain expenses and suggest that they should not be recovered from ratepayers. The stockholders can recover them if they want, or, basically eat them. But ratepayers should not. A two-step analysis of the dichotomy. So absent having testimony by staff or an intervener, DPA, whatever, I think you'd be hard pressed to look at a document and say, okay, well, this investment on page 25, I think is imprudent, because you're not the expert, you're the decision maker. And I don't think you can, argue, well, I just don't think that is appropriate. You could direct your staff to go out. I don't think this is appropriate. I want you to take a look at this, hire somebody and analyze it, because I have I think it's not right. That clearly is your right. And then if the analysis came back and you were proven right, or the expert or whomever now has evidence saying, well, this is why that is true, then you could say, yes, I agree with that and decide. But you couldn't sua sponte look at something that wasn't presented to you as evidence in the case and say, oh, well, I think this is, not acceptable.
Okay. And so if the commission's driven to allow or disallow an investment, does the commission then interfere with necessary business decisions that could impact reliability, safety, and so on?
Theoretically, yes. And it also goes back to the issue I raised at the end about people argue, well, the cost of doing business in Delaware has changed. We used to have the presumption that everything we did was, good faith, business judgment. Now we potentially could be subject to a different type of review, which might cause disallowances. So the risk of doing business in Delaware has increased. I think it's a hard argument to make, given the fact that Exelon in particular operates in all these other states, and then everybody else has prudency as a standard, but it's a difference. And I think, potentially somebody could make that argument, but I don't think it would be successful.
So should we anticipate, now normally we just confirm that the company's IRPs are prepared on schedule. Should we anticipate now from, for example, the public advocate that there's more prudence scrutiny over an IRP? And does that present a different role for the commission?
We'll see what happens here, Your Honor. What Mr. Geddes was saying, I don't think the changes from business judgment to prudency will change the day-to-day differences in rate cases, how they're litigated, in terms of discovery requests and what's presented to the commission.
Fair statement with respect to rate cases, but I have been here long enough to hear others in the public advocate seat raise concerns when an IRP is presented or drafted. And so I'm trying to get my head around whether or not we're going to start seeing more prudence challenges coming in at the IRP submission.
I suspect you probably will, to a certain degree.
I would hope not.
We're going to have a fun time. I guess.
So my understanding is that the business or the prudency standard is applying to rate cases. And generally, the lawmakers, deciders of law, you all, will not rule on an issue until it is before you. And so when we talk about whether or not an investment is prudent, they're going to, the utilities have to present the IRP, but that's just a plan. So you're not evaluating a plan based on prudency. You're not going to have all the facts and information at the time the IRP is presented. However, when it comes to a rate case, it doesn't really matter. Well, there's not a decision in Delaware, but there are in other jurisdictions that it doesn't really matter what happened at the planning stage in terms of government regulation, whether or not we approve the IRP or not. What matters is when the rate case comes before the commission, what you decide then. So theoretically, you could approve an IRP with an investment that later, when we do the rate case and you get more information and more knowledge about decision-making that happened, it turns out maybe that was imprudent. And so what we don't want is to have prudent decisions made at the IRP level when we don't have all the information. And then when it comes to the rate case, the last thing we want is to look back at what we've already done when we made a decision without all the information to then affect whatever happens in the rate case. So I'm saying the IRP is going to be, we're not going to be questioning prudence at the IRP level. The IRP is separate. We're going to be questioning prudence only at the rate case level.
Look at the Florida case. There's a citation to it, and that's like the dichotomy between the planning process and because the only way that investment gets into rates is through a rate case.
Okay, got it. I think I have one more question. So, what level of rationale, proof, or evidence will the commission or commissioners need to justify a declaration of imprudence?
Well, it's like any other issue in the sense of you will need evidence sponsored by a witness that indicates that the decision to make the investment or to incur the expense was not reasonable based on what was known at the time, you looking at it a year or two hence. Back to my ice skating example. It's hard to do because remember, you also have the caveat, you can't use hindsight. So if you know things now that the reasonable person didn't know at the time the investment was made, you can't use that knowledge to disallow the expense.
Okay, I think that pretty much covers most of my concerns. It feels like the little bit of the balance, you talk just and reasonable on behalf of the ratepayer, but there is some of that with respect to keeping the utility healthy as well. And so it seems like some of the balance has shifted. There's a little bit more risk on the utility side. It feels like to me, but I guess we have to kind of experience it to see, what the outcomes are going to be.
But-
Thank you very much again for all of the insight, the answers to the question.
If I can just follow up on it, utilities have been, since at least 1980s, have been dealing with prudency in other jurisdictions. And so I think they're well aware of how this works. I think it's new for these commissioners. I'll leave you with the last bit of wisdom, and this is free opinion. The legislature, in its infinite wisdom, have passed Senate Bill 59, and if I'm correct, it's going to cause more work. Maybe you should get a pay raise. Oh, and also, and council says also for council too.
Mr. Gaddis, you've been around here long enough to know where the heavy lifting is done. That was a statement on behalf of staff, for sure, and I support it completely.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair.
So, going back to Commissioner Drexler's question about whether this will increase costs in the short term, um, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it might until this commission establishes some precedent about what is prudent and what is not in Delaware. I know you said that there's prudence in other jurisdictions, but it's not all the same. So we may incur some costs as we battle out, in front of the commission, what is prudent and what is not.
I think it's the mouse and the snake kind of thing. That in the beginning, there may be some attempts to establish it, but again, I think most of it is fact specific. The standard's there. And again, the coal case, I think, is an easy one. If you agree with the analysis, is that, you should have caps on escalators and you shouldn't send somebody from Harvard to negotiate with a bunch of people in West Virginia. They might, they might take advantage of you. No disrespect to Harvard. But I think that's an easy one. But some of these other ones, like the Indian River 4 tower, that could be a much harder one to apply. But again, I think the experts, if we hire good experts, I think it'll make hopefully the commission's job easier.
I want to thank Mr. Geddes for doing this for us. Well, that's right. Time will tell.
Well, this is a bookend for me.
Okay.
I began as a neophyte. Some people say I'm still a neophyte, arguing in the Supreme Court and, shall we say, getting smacked. And here I am 40 years later saying, I was right all along.
It just took 40 years for you to convince us.
Slow on the uptake.
Our next meeting is April 22nd, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, I just have one comment for the folks in the room. This is kind of personal. I'm going to have a left knee replaced 2 weeks from tomorrow. It served me really well, so don't anybody cry over those. But I probably will not be physically showing up in the room, but will do my best to join by Zoom to sustain my engagement. Thank you very much.
Drugs, remember drugs, heavy drugs.
If there are no other comments to come before us, meeting is adjourned.